model of development which is based on free flow of capital and of dependence on exports was something that was taught to us by the United States and by institutions like the World Bank and IMF. And now this model is suffering a major setback. She should allow Asia to think through the crisis itself and to come out with its own solutions, and not to be lectured about currencies or about how Asia should tackle the crisis and so on.
Can you talk about the connection between the financial crisis and food?
I think that the food crisis that we had, last year, the shooting up of prices, the shortages of food and so on, were caused partly by speculation, as now you see the prices are now shooting down. So we have the financial markets that actually led to this crisis in housing and in joblessness, also affecting food through the mechanism of financial speculation. So we have to really regulate and stop this financial speculation. But secondly, the food crisis in many parts of Africa, for example, or even in Latin America, was also partly caused by the wrong advice given by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They went to Africa and told the African governments to stop investing in agriculture and to reduce their subsidies in agriculture, to stop buying products from the farmers on the ground that subsidies are bad for the Africans. And what happened was that the tariffs were also reduced. The tariffs for food products was also reduced in many African countries, and as a result of which, cheap rice, which was subsidized in the United States, or cheap chicken that is subsidized in Europe, flooded the markets in Ghana, in many parts of West Africa and so on, decimating the agricultural sector. So this is the period where we have to review the entire way in which we view food. President Clinton in the United Nations last month actually said, he admitted that we blew it, including himself, that we gave the wrong policies to Africa, we imposed on them, and we have to rethink all our policies.
Martin Khor, you've been a long-time anti-corporate globalization activist. You've been at forum after forum all over the world. The protectionism was intensely debated at the G7 meeting, including the Buy American clause in the U.S. stimulus package. Can you explain what that is? I mean, you've just described how the U.S., how these international financial institutions fought for poorer countries over these years to stop being protectionist, and yet they've included this protectionist clause in this stimulus package to protect Americans.
When you're a poor country, and you don't have efficient industries, then you have to protect your domestic industries from cheap imports coming in, especially the cheap imports are subsidized. Now we are finding in the financial crisis a big hypocrisy in that the rich governments like the United States are telling the rest of the world to continue to open up their economies when the U.S. is pumping trillions of dollars of subsidies to their companies which would otherwise have failed. So if our developing countries are to open up our markets, we will find failed motorcar companies, as in Detroit, being able to sell their cars more cheaply abroad because of the subsidies given to them. Failed banks like Citibank will be able to invade developing countries where our banks, our local banks, are also going to fail. But we don't have trillions of dollars to prop up our failed banks. And we don't want the failed banks of the United States or Europe or Japan to come and invade our territory. So this Buy American clause in the stimulus package, you're going to spend an extra $800 billion through public expenditure. Much of it will be in public works and so on. But if the products, the steel and the manufactured products that go into these projects have to be sourced from the United States itself, then this will block out products coming from Asia or from Africa or from Latin America, and therefore add on to the gloom that we are already facing with the collapse of our exports.
President Obama is signing this economic stimulus package in Denver at the Museum of Nature and Science. The site was picked in part because it has 465 solar panels on its roof. You have written, if the United States and Europe can come up with so many trillions of dollars to save their financial institutions within a few months, surely there's money to tackle the climate crisis, which is a far bigger problem involving the world's survival.
Well, you know that we are going to have this big Copenhagen conference in December, and we need to have a global deal in order to globally deal with the climate crisis. But the developing world does not have the money or the technology to be able to switch their economies to a low-carbon society and a low-carbon economy. So the gateway to a global deal, as far as the developing countries are concerned, is to be able to establish a fund within the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, which will be able to fund the technological changes and the economic changes that we have to have in the developing countries. If we are able to find $4 trillion to subsidize banks and motorcar companies in the space of 5 to 6 months, surely we can come up with $100 billion for a start to launch a fund within the United Nations to help the developing countries to tackle climate change. If we do not have such a fund, then we will, I believe, we will find it very difficult to have a global deal to deal with climate change, and we are going to face an environmental devastation. So in a way, the economic crisis has been positive in that it has shown us that if there is a political will, the trillions of dollars will be possible. And what greater cause can we devote than to come up with helping the developing countries to deal with climate change and poverty at the same time.
You just heard the Director of Intelligence, Dennis Blair, saying that the economic crisis has become a greater concern than terrorism.
I think he is right, because when people are economically insecure, when they don't have jobs, when they are in poverty, and there is no hope in the system, then of course they will have to turn to whatever means they think they need to do out of sheer frustration and hopelessness. So we need to tackle the problem of jobs and poverty in the developing countries, and unfortunately, with the recession that began in the United States, the economy is going to plunge in the developing world. So we need to rethink the way the global economy is run, and we have to give the freedom to developing countries to have the policy options that they require to rebuild their economies with the help of finance and technology, and with, at the same time, the need to tackle climate change side by side.
Finally, the World Bank saying the crisis could push 100 million more people into poverty and child mortality rates soaring.
I think this is a gross underestimate. You know, I read in the papers Gordon Brown, the UK Prime Minister's chief economic advisor, Ed Balls, saying last week that this depression is going to be worse than the Great Depression. It'll be the worst depression in more than 100 years, and that the effects are going to last for 15 years. We have already seen 20 million jobs lost in China in the last few months, and this is only the beginning. I know the trade unions are very worried about China, and you have lost 3 million jobs in the United States, but in China they have already lost 20 million jobs because of the loss of exports to the United States and the rest of the world. And this is only China. What about Africa? What about so many other countries? We could have 1 billion more people in the developing world plunging into new poverty because of this crisis.
Martin Khor, I want to thank you for being with us at the Third World Network and the South Center. Our website is democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.